Title: The Whispers in the Walls. Chapter 1: The Arrival. It was the kind of house that everyone would avoid if they had the choice. An old mansion, perched on the edge of a forgotten town. Overgrown vines crawled up the walls like ancient tendrils, and the windows were covered in a thick layer of grime that obscured the view. For as long as anyone could remember, it had been empty. Abandoned. An eyesore that only the bravest or most desperate would dare to approach. But then there was Evelyn. She had always been drawn to old things, to forgotten places, to the stories they held. So, when the opportunity came to move into a house that no one had lived in for decades, she jumped at it. No one could explain why she felt so compelled, but she did. Her friends thought she was crazy. Her family was worried. But Evelyn was set. She was tired of the city, tired of the noise, tired of the endless cycle of meaningless routine. A change of pace, a change of scenery, this old mansion would give her just that. The first day she arrived, the sun hung low in the sky, casting long, haunting shadows across the overgrown garden. Evelyn stood at the base of the long, cracked stone driveway, her eyes scanning the silhouette of the house in front of her. It looked like something out of a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. The paint on the walls was peeling, the roof sagging under years of neglect. Yet, there was something about it that called to her. She dragged her suitcase up the path, the sound of gravel crunching underfoot like a warning. She couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching her, waiting for her to make the next move. But Evelyn didn't believe in such nonsense. Ghosts, spirits, the supernatural, they were all just stories to scare children. She was an adult, and she knew better. When she finally stepped through the front door, the air felt heavy. The scent of mildew and dust hit her instantly, and the creaking of the floorboards under her feet seemed to echo in the empty house. She stood still for a moment, letting the silence envelop her. There was something eerie about it. Something oppressive in the stillness. But she shrugged it off, setting down her bags and taking in the dimly lit entryway. The walls were lined with faded portraits, their faces covered in layers of dust. They stared at her with cold, glassy eyes. Evelyn wasn't sure if it was her imagination, but they seemed to shift slightly as if watching her every movement. "You're just tired," she muttered to herself, heading into the kitchen to make herself a cup of tea. Chapter 2: The Unseen Presence. That night, as the wind howled outside, Evelyn tried to settle into her new home. She unpacked a few belongings, then retired to the large master bedroom at the far end of the house. The bed was old, its frame creaking under her weight, but it would do. She pulled the covers over her and closed her eyes, ready to get some much-needed rest. But sleep wouldn't come. At first, it was subtle. A faint rustling noise. A soft creak from somewhere deep in the house. Evelyn told herself it was just the house settling. But then, the noises grew louder. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps echoing from the hallway outside her room. She sat up in bed, heart pounding. "Hello?" she called out, her voice shaking slightly. No response. She rose from the bed, gripping a flashlight she had brought with her, though she knew it wouldn't do much against whatever was causing the sounds. The hallway was empty, the darkness stretching far down the corridor like an endless void. The air felt colder, heavier, as if something was pressing down on her. She moved cautiously, her flashlight beam sweeping across the walls and floor. Her footsteps were too loud, too intrusive in the stillness of the house. The footsteps stopped, as if waiting for her to catch up. She turned sharply, her eyes scanning every corner of the hallway. Nothing. Yet, the feeling of being watched was unmistakable. Every nerve in her body screamed that she was not alone. A soft whisper brushed past her ear. Barely audible, like the faintest breath. But it was enough. Leave. Evelyn spun around, her heart in her throat, but there was no one there. Her pulse raced. She had to be imagining things. The house was old, after all. Old houses creaked, groaned, and made strange noises. But the whispers didn't stop. They were there the next night. And the night after that. Chapter 3, The Secrets Beneath. Days turned into weeks, and the house slowly began to reveal its darker side. Strange occurrences became more frequent. The temperature in certain rooms would plummet for no reason. Objects would be found in places she was certain she hadn't left them. A book, an old leather-bound journal, appeared on her kitchen table one morning. She hadn't brought it in, and there was no sign of how it had gotten there. But it was the whispers that grew worse. They were no longer faint. No longer soft. Now, they spoke clearly, urgently, like a voice calling from within the walls. Help us! Help us! The sound seemed to come from everywhere. From the walls, from the floor, from beneath the stairs. Sometimes it was just one voice. Other times, it was a chorus of voices, moaning, begging, pleading. One evening, Evelyn could no longer ignore it. She followed the whispers, her heart pounding in her chest. They led her to the basement. The door, which she had avoided since moving in, seemed to beckon her with a force she couldn't explain. She opened it, the hinges groaning in protest as the darkness beyond stretched out before her. She reached for the light switch, her hand trembling. The dim light flickered to life, revealing a long, narrow staircase leading down into the bowels of the house. And that's when she saw it. At the bottom of the stairs, something gleamed faintly in the half-light. A strange, metallic glint. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. As she descended, the smell of decay grew stronger, and the air felt thick, oppressive. There, lying on the floor in a pool of dried blood, was a doll. It was old, the fabric of its dress torn, its face cracked and chipped. But what made it truly unsettling was the way its eyes seemed to follow her. She could have sworn that, for just a moment, the doll blinked. Evelyn stepped forward, her body trembling. As her hand reached down to pick up the doll, the whispers returned, louder, more insistent. Take it. Take it. Bring it home. Chapter 4, The Diary. The doll lay heavy in Evelyn's hands as she returned to the main floor, its glassy eyes staring up at her with an unsettling intensity. She felt an inexplicable need to keep it close, like it was calling to her, pulling her into something dark and twisted. She placed it on the living room mantel, the flickering light from the fireplace casting long, twisted shadows across its cracked porcelain face. That night, the whispers came again. But this time, they were different, more insistent, more frantic. They echoed through the entire house, as if the walls themselves were alive, crying out in desperation. Evelyn pulled the covers tightly around herself, trying to block out the sounds. But it was no use. The whispers grew louder until they drowned out her thoughts, until they filled her head with something dark. She could no longer ignore it. The doll, the whispers. They were connected somehow. It was no coincidence that the voices had started after she found it. The feeling of dread in her chest intensified. She needed to understand. She needed to know what was happening to her, what the house wanted. The next morning, she ventured down into the basement again. The doll still sat on the mantel in the living room, its eyes following her every move. The sight of it made her stomach churn, but she pushed the feeling aside. There was something more urgent now, something she couldn't ignore. Evelyn searched the basement, her eyes falling on the cluttered shelves that lined the walls. Old boxes, dusty furniture, and forgotten relics of a past life. But then something caught her eye, a weathered, leather-bound journal, half hidden beneath a stack of yellowed newspapers. She picked it up, brushing off the dust. The cover was cracked, but the pages inside were surprisingly intact. She opened it carefully, the first page revealing a series of strange symbols and dates. Some of the ink was faded, barely legible, but there were enough words for her to understand. It was the diary of someone who had lived in the house long before her. As she read, the truth began to unfold. The house wasn't just old, it was cursed. A dark, malevolent force had been tied to it for generations. The diary spoke of strange rituals, of people disappearing without a trace, of a spirit bound to the walls of the house. The whispers that had haunted Evelyn were the cries of those who had been trapped here, victims of the house's twisted hunger. But what made her blood run cold was the final entry. The doll is the key. Take it, and you will awaken it. Bring it home, and it will feed. Do not fear it, for it is not your enemy, it is your salvation. Evelyn dropped the diary as the room seemed to darken. A cold breeze brushed past her, and she turned to see the basement door slowly creaking shut behind her. The whispers were no longer just in her head, they were all around her, coming from the walls, from the very foundation of the house. She had to get out. Chapter 5, The Awakening. Evelyn didn't sleep that night. She couldn't. Every shadow seemed to hold something, every creak of the floorboards too loud in the silence. The whispers grew stronger, and the temperature in the house dropped to an unbearable chill. It was as though the mansion itself was alive, breathing, shifting, feeding off her fear. The doll, still perched on the mantel, seemed to be waiting for her. Evelyn's mind raced as she recalled the words from the diary. The doll was the key, what did that mean? Was it supposed to be the source of the house's power? Or was it merely a vessel, a conduit for something far darker? She couldn't stay in the house any longer. She had to leave. But when she reached for her keys, she froze. In the reflection of the window, she saw it. The doll was no longer where she had left it. It sat now on the edge of the fireplace, facing her, its cracked face smiling. Evelyn stumbled back, her heart pounding in her chest. The smile on the doll's face twisted, and then, just as quickly, it was gone. In its place was the unmistakable shape of a shadow standing just behind her. Before she could turn around, the temperature plummeted. A gust of wind slammed through the house, the doors rattling in their frames. The lights flickered, casting her into a series of brief, disorienting flashes. In each flash, she saw something, someone, moving in the periphery of her vision. Figures, pale and gaunt, with eyes that burned with an unnatural light. The house was no longer a home. It was a tomb. She spun around, but there was nothing there. The shadow had vanished. Except for the whisper. Stay, it said, a voice low and guttural, as if it were coming from the very depths of the earth. Chapter 6, The Price of Salvation. The days blurred together as Evelyn tried to make sense of what was happening. She couldn't escape the house. Every attempt to leave led her back to the front door, only to find it locked, as if it had never been open. The whispers never stopped. They followed her from room to room, curling in her ears, urging her to listen, to understand. But the more she heard, the less she wanted to. The house had become a prison, and she was its latest captive. One night, she ventured into the basement again. The house seemed to pulse with a strange energy, as if the walls themselves were alive, watching her every move. She couldn't fight it anymore. She had to know the truth. At the foot of the stairs, she saw the doll again, sitting just as it had been before. But this time, there was something different about it. Its eyes were glowing, faintly, with an unnatural red light. And in the corner of her vision, she saw a figure standing behind it, tall, pale, and draped in shadow. Evelyn took a step forward, drawn to the doll, her body moving against her will. The figure in the corner spoke in a voice that sounded like dry leaves rustling in the wind. "You have awakened it. And now, you must pay the price." Before she could react, the floor beneath her feet cracked open, and she was plunged into darkness. Chapter 7, The Final Choice. Evelyn awoke in a different place, a place that seemed to stretch on forever, a vast, endless darkness. There was no floor, no ceiling, no walls. Just an overwhelming sense of emptiness. But then, she heard it again. The whispers. Now louder than ever. "Choose." The voice came from all around her, vibrating through her bones. "Choose what?" Evelyn shouted into the void, her voice cracking. And then she saw it. The doll. It floated before her, suspended in the air. Its cracked face, its hollow eyes, its twisted smile. It was the source of everything, the heart of the house's dark power. "Take it," the voice whispered. "Take the doll, and you will be free." Evelyn hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She didn't understand what was happening, but she knew one thing for sure: this house, this mansion, was alive. And it wanted her. She reached out, her hand trembling as she grabbed the doll. The moment her fingers closed around it, the world around her shifted. The darkness receded, and she was back in the mansion. But it was different now. The air was thick with a suffocating presence. The walls seemed to pulse with an unnatural life. And the whispers, oh, the whispers, were louder than ever. She had chosen. And now, there would be no escape. Chapter 8, The Binding. The house had claimed her, just as it had claimed countless others before. Evelyn was no longer alone. The spirits, the voices, the figures, everything she had seen and heard, they were now a part of her, bound to her as much as she was bound to the mansion. But Evelyn knew one thing now: she had awakened the house's true power. And it was hungry. The doll, now sitting in her hands, pulsed with an energy that was both terrifying and intoxicating. She could feel its presence inside her, feeding on her fear, feeding on her very soul. The house had what it wanted. And it was never going to let her go. Chapter 9, The Price of Power. Evelyn awoke the next morning, though the word morning no longer seemed to hold any meaning. The sun didn't rise anymore, the sky outside her window was always the same, a deep, unyielding grey. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of something decaying, as though time itself had stopped in the mansion. The doll remained in her hands, even as she moved throughout the house. She couldn't remember when she had picked it up again, but it was always there, staring at her, its eyes gleaming faintly red. The whispers had not stopped since she touched it, they were now a constant hum in the back of her mind, urging her onward, telling her things she wasn't sure she wanted to hear. In the kitchen, Evelyn noticed something strange. The The wooden table she had eaten at the night before was now covered in old, yellowing paper. There was something written on them, scrawled in a jagged, uneven hand. Her breath caught in her throat when she recognized the words. They were familiar. You have begun the process. The ritual is in motion. There is no turning back. Evelyn felt her heart race. The last time she had read such words, they had been in the diary she found in the basement, the same words that had warned her of the consequences of waking the spirit bound to the doll. She hadn't realized it at the time, but she was now part of something much darker than she could ever have imagined. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. Embrace it. Take the power. Complete the ritual. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She didn't know what would happen if she followed the voice, but she knew that resistance was futile. She was already a part of this cursed house. With the doll still in her hands, she headed toward the basement again, the steps creaking beneath her as she descended into the darkness. The basement was colder than usual, the air thick with an unnatural presence. The walls seemed to bend inward, and the shadows twisted into shapes that weren't there before. Figures moved in the corners of her vision, whispers now a cacophony, filling her ears, drowning out her thoughts. At the center of the basement stood a stone altar, covered in what looked like dried blood. The stone was old, etched with runes that pulsed faintly in the dim light. Evelyn didn't know how she knew, but she understood now. This was the heart of the mansion, the very source of its malevolent power. The doll was the key to unlocking whatever dark forces had been trapped in this place. The ritual was meant to bind the spirits, to feed the entity that lurked within these walls. And now, she was the vessel. Place it on the altar, the voice commanded. Trembling, Evelyn obeyed. She placed the doll gently on the stone surface, its eyes flickering to life with a glowing intensity. For a moment, nothing happened. The air seemed to hold its breath. Then, all at once, the walls shook, and a deep, resonating voice filled the space, reverberating through her chest. You have awakened me. You have given me power. The temperature in the room dropped drastically, the air turning sharp with cold. A dark shape began to materialize in front of her, rising from the altar. The figure was tall, clothed in a flowing black cloak that swirled like smoke. Its face was obscured, but Evelyn could feel its gaze upon her, cold, hungry. You will serve me now, the figure boomed, its voice a chorus of whispers and screams. Chapter 10, The Shifting Walls. Evelyn stumbled back, her heart racing, but the figure before her only loomed larger. The mansion had changed, its very essence was warping, shifting. The walls seemed to bend and undulate, as if the house itself were alive, responding to the entity's awakening. You thought you could leave? The voice was everywhere now, surrounding her. Evelyn could feel it, this was not just a house. It was a prison. A prison built to contain the entity that had been sealed here for centuries. And she had unwittingly freed it. The figure lifted its hand, and with a flick of its fingers, the basement door slammed shut, trapping her inside. Evelyn's breath quickened as the walls began to close in, the space shrinking. The air felt suffocating. Every corner of the basement was now alive with movement, shadows crawling, twisting, like fingers reaching out to grab her. The doll on the altar began to levitate, spinning in the air. The red light from its eyes flickered and pulsed like a heartbeat. And then, the figure spoke again, its voice now a hiss, low and serpentine. You must make a choice, Evelyn. Her mind reeled. The mansion was no longer a place of refuge, it was a trap. A trap designed to consume her. The whispers rose to a crescendo, and the figure continued, its voice dripping with malice. Serve me, and you will have power beyond your wildest dreams. Reject me, and you will become like the others. Lost. Forgotten. Trapped in this house for eternity. Evelyn's thoughts raced. She could feel the presence of the spirits, the trapped souls of those who had come before her, crying out in agony. They were all part of the mansion now, part of the entity's power. And now, she had to decide. To succumb, or to fight. The entity's form began to flicker, shifting, as if it were losing patience. Time is running out. Make your choice, or be consumed. Chapter 11, The Bargain. Evelyn closed her eyes, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. She couldn't bear the idea of becoming another lost soul, another whisper in the walls. But the power was tempting. It called to her. The promise of control, of freedom from the pain she had known in her life, was alluring. The air in the basement became thick, oppressive, as if every inch of space was charged with the entity's hunger. Evelyn felt her resolve crumbling, her fear pulling her deeper into the house's grip. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she grabbed the doll from the altar. For a moment, everything went still. Then, the world shifted. The house groaned, and a cold, suffocating darkness enveloped her. Evelyn gasped for air as the power surged through her, filling her, burning with intensity. The entity's laughter filled the air, a sound like the screeching of metal against stone. You have chosen wisely, it purred. You are mine now, Evelyn. She felt the house, its very walls, wrap around her, the spirits of the mansion whispering her name, now a part of her. But something was different now. The power she had claimed, the power of the doll, was not what she expected. It wasn't just a tool for her own control. It was a bond. A connection to the entity, to the mansion's twisted soul. She had become a part of it, just as much as it had become a part of her. In that moment, Evelyn realized the truth. There was no escaping. There was no leaving. The house had claimed her, and she had become its new keeper, its new prisoner. Her eyes flickered open, and she looked around. The mansion was alive, more alive than ever. The walls pulsed with energy, the shadows now part of her. She could feel the whispers, the souls, the power. She was no longer alone. She was the house. Chapter 12, The New Keeper. Days, weeks, or maybe even years passed. It was hard to tell in the timeless, cursed mansion. Evelyn had become something else. No longer fully human, yet not completely bound by the house's dark power, she walked the halls like a ghost, part of the mansion, part of the entity that now ruled it. The whispers were hers now, a constant presence in her mind, guiding her, feeding her. The souls of the lost were hers to command, their voices echoing through the walls, their eyes following her every step. She had become the new keeper of the mansion. The doll, the source of her power, remained in her hands, its eyes forever watching, forever glowing with that unnatural red light. It was her connection to the entity, and she could feel its hunger, its need for more. There would always be more to take. More souls. More victims. And Evelyn, the new keeper, would never let them go. Chapter 13, The Feast of Souls. The mansion no longer felt like the house it once was. Its halls were darker now, filled with the oppressive weight of countless lost souls. Evelyn walked through them, her footsteps echoing off the cold, stone floors, but she was no longer alone. The spirits, now bound to her as part of the mansion, drifted alongside her, their faces twisted in eternal torment. She could feel them tugging at her, pulling at the edges of her mind. The voices, whispers at first, had grown stronger, more insistent, more demanding. "Take us. Use us," they whispered. "We hunger. We want release." The mansion had become a prison for their souls, just as it had become a prison for hers. Yet there was something intoxicating about the power now coursing through her. She had become one with the house, and the house was alive with hunger, with need. The mansion had fed on the lives of those who had wandered too close, and now, it fed on her. She could sense their desperation, the trapped souls that had once been flesh and blood, now bound to the house by an ancient, insidious force. It was not enough for the mansion to feed on them, it craved more, wanted more. The whispers grew louder, swirling in her head like a storm. "You must feed it. You must feed us." The mansion itself seemed to respond to the growing hunger, the walls trembling, the shadows stretching and twisting. It was calling to her, urging her to release the pent-up energy of the souls trapped within. She could feel the power pulsing beneath her skin, a dark force that could be wielded. But as she stood there, at the edge of the dining room, staring at the long, blood-stained table that stretched out before her, Evelyn realized something terrible. This was not just a house of the dead. It was a house of consumption. It took, it fed, and it would never stop. And now, she was its new vessel. Chapter 14, The Master's Return. Evelyn's transformation had been gradual, a slow bleed from one reality to another. She had become the house's keeper, but she wasn't its true master, not yet. The entity that had first spoken to her in the basement, the dark, formless figure, wasn't truly gone. It was still here, in the shadows, still feeding off her, growing stronger by the day. She could feel its presence creeping in the corners of her mind, dark tendrils wrapping around her thoughts. "You have awakened me," the voice growled, not as a whisper, but as a powerful, resonating force. "But you have not yet made me whole. You are only the keeper." "But I am the master." Evelyn trembled. The house shook as if it were a living thing, the floorboards vibrating beneath her feet. She could feel it now, the mansion was in turmoil, the walls straining against the power within them. It was time for the entity to take its true form. The air around her turned ice cold, and the shadows stretched impossibly long. The mansion was alive with an ancient, primal energy. The doll, still clutched in her hand, seemed to hum with dark power, its eyes glowing brighter, the red light flickering wildly. And then, she saw it. The figure appeared before her again, this time in full form. It was tall, towering over her, cloaked in shadow. Its face remained hidden, but its eyes gleamed like fiery pits, burning with an unnatural light. "You have done well, Evelyn," it rumbled, its voice low and gravelly. "But now, I claim what is mine." Evelyn felt the power surge through her once more, but this time, it was different. This time, it wasn't just the house, it was the entity itself. The walls seemed to close in, the mansion becoming a prison within a prison, and Evelyn realized with a shock of horror that she was no longer the keeper. She was the sacrifice. Chapter 15, The Broken Bond. As the entity loomed over her, Evelyn tried to move, but her limbs felt heavy, as though the weight of the mansion itself was holding her in place. The whispers, the voices of the trapped souls, now screamed in her ears, begging her to do something, anything, to stop what was happening. But she could do nothing. The power that had once been hers was slipping away, like sand through her fingers. The doll in her hands was no longer a source of strength, It was a tether that bound her to the mansion's will, a link between the house and the entity that had been awakened. She could feel the pull, a gnawing hunger in the pit of her stomach, as if something inside her was tearing apart. "You were never meant to be the master," the entity snarled, its voice a mix of fury and mockery. "You were always meant to serve." The room around her began to warp, the walls stretching and bending, distorting until the mansion itself seemed to fold in on itself. The air was thick, and a cold, unnatural mist filled the space. Evelyn could hear the cries of the souls, louder now, almost as though they were in pain. The entity's form flickered, a blur of shadow and light, as though it was struggling to maintain its shape. "You have failed," it hissed, its voice crackling like dry leaves. "You think you are free, but you are just another piece in the game. You will remain here. You will feed me. And when I am whole, there will be nothing left." Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as the realization struck her. The mansion had never been a home. It was a trap, a cage meant to hold the entity and the souls it devoured. It had called to her, fed on her weaknesses, and used her to release it from its prison. Now, it was time for her to pay the price. Her body trembled as the doll's eyes glowed brighter, its red light burning into her skin. The walls of the house seemed to pulse with a life of their own, thrumming with the power of the spirits and the entity. The room began to spin, the shadows growing longer and darker. Then, everything went black. Chapter 16, The New Master. When Evelyn awoke, she was no longer in the mansion. At least, not the mansion she remembered. The house was still there, its walls stretching into the void, but it felt different. The air was suffocating, the silence deafening. The oppressive presence of the entity was everywhere, suffusing every corner of the house, its energy woven into the very fabric of the walls. But Evelyn wasn't just a keeper anymore. The doll in her hand pulsed with life, its eyes burning with a demonic glow. She could feel the entity inside her, its power coursing through her veins, but it wasn't in control anymore. She was. The mansion, the house of horrors, had become her domain. She was no longer its victim. She was its ruler. The power that had once enslaved her now flowed through her, and with it came a terrible understanding. The house, the doll, the entity, they were all part of her now. And the souls that had once been trapped here, lost and begging for release, they would never escape. Evelyn turned her gaze toward the endless hallways, the shadows that writhed in the corners, the whispers that seemed to have grown silent. She smiled. She had become the master. And now, it was her turn to feed. Chapter 17, The Endless Hunger. As the new ruler of the mansion, Evelyn became something more than human. The mansion was her kingdom, and its hunger, its insatiable need for souls, was her legacy. The walls would never be silent again, and the house would never be empty. New victims would always find their way to her, drawn by the whispers, allured by the promise of a home. And when they arrived, they would join the others, trapped in the mansion, their souls bound to her will. Just as Evelyn had once been. The house had no end. Its hunger had no limits. And neither did she. Chapter 18, The Eternal Night. The mansion had changed. It was no longer just a place of haunted memories and lost souls, it was a reflection of Evelyn herself. The walls pulsed with an unnatural rhythm, the floors creaked under the weight of the souls trapped within, and the shadows seemed to stretch with a life of their own. Evelyn wandered the halls, her steps echoing through the corridors, but she no longer felt the weight of fear. The house was hers. The mansion's dark essence had become a part of her very being. She could feel the heartbeat of the house, the thrum of life within its walls. The mansion responded to her every whim, bending to her will. But with this power came a terrible burden. The whispers that had once been the voices of the lost souls now came to her in waves. They weren't just pleas for release anymore. They were demands, reminders of what she had become. "You are our queen now," they whispered in unison, their voices low and guttural. "Feed us. Feed on them." Evelyn had learned to ignore the voices, or at least to pretend she did. The mansion had become a sanctuary for the dead, a never-ending cycle of consumption. Every day, the house drew in new victims, travelers, wanderers, people lured by the false promises of refuge. Every day, the mansion claimed another soul. Every day, Evelyn fed. But something had begun to shift. The hunger, the endless need for more, had started to feel less like a part of her power and more like a weight. She had once been driven by a desire for control, for freedom, but now, all she felt was emptiness. In the farthest corner of the mansion, there was a door she had never opened. It had always been. "You said." Chapter 20, The Forgotten Depths. The further Evelyn descended, the more she felt the weight of the mansion's past pressing down on her. The air grew thick, suffocating, the shadows whispering, but not the usual desperate cries for release. These were different. These whispers were ancient, forgotten, whispers from a time long before Evelyn had ever set foot in this cursed place. As she reached the bottom of the staircase, she found herself standing in a vast, cavernous chamber. The walls were lined with symbols, runes, glyphs, markings she couldn't read. They pulsed with dark energy, resonating in her chest like a distant heartbeat. It felt like the very foundation of the house itself had been built upon this place, upon these rituals. In the center of the room was an altar. It was much older than the stone altar she had seen in the basement, even older than the mansion itself. The air around it shimmered with power, raw, unrefined, and ancient. Evelyn's heart raced as she approached it. The whispers grew louder, now nearly deafening, but she couldn't understand them. The words twisted and changed with every passing second, like a language she almost knew but couldn't grasp. And then, suddenly, they stopped. A voice, deep and commanding, filled the room. "You should not be here." Evelyn froze. The voice was ancient, filled with authority that made her blood run cold. The shadows around her seemed to thicken, folding in on themselves, until a figure began to emerge from the darkness. It was a tall figure, draped in tattered robes that seemed to blend with the shadows. Its face was hidden by a hood, but Evelyn could feel its gaze upon her, piercing her very soul. "You have awakened what should have stayed buried," the voice continued, colder than the void around them. "You have taken the mantle of master, but you are not the first. And you will not be the last." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She was no longer the only one. There had been others before her, other masters who had come to this house, taken its power, and been consumed by it. She realized, with growing horror, that this figure was not just a ghost, it was a witness. A guardian. "You cannot control it," the figure intoned. "The hunger of this place is endless. And you, like the others, will become part of it. You will never leave." Evelyn felt a sharp pang of fear, but something deeper within her stirred. Was it fear? Or was it the familiar pull of hunger? She had already given herself to the mansion, and the power it offered was too intoxicating. She had no intention of backing down now. "I am the master here," she declared, her voice steady despite the chaos swirling in her mind. "I control this place." The figure chuckled darkly, its laugh like the grinding of stone. It stepped closer, its form flickering in and out of existence. "You do not control it," it said softly. "You are but a puppet. And the strings are not yours." Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. The air seemed to crackle with energy. She could feel the mansion's power building again, resonating with the ancient force standing before her. But this time, something felt different. The very walls of the chamber seemed to tremble as if they, too, were caught between the past and the present. A terrible realization dawned on Evelyn. The mansion had not only consumed the lives of its victims, it had consumed their souls, their very essence, and every master who had taken control had been absorbed into it. The mansion was alive, alive in a way she could not yet understand. And she was a part of that cycle. The entity before her, the Guardian, was the first, perhaps the original master. And now, it was her turn to face the truth. Chapter 21, The First Master. As the figure moved closer, Evelyn's mind spun with questions. Who was this entity? What was its true purpose? Why had it remained hidden in this dark, forgotten corner of the mansion? The figure's voice, when it spoke again, was filled with something darker, something ancient and final. "I was the first," it said, its tone unwavering. "The first to bind myself to this place. The first to become one with it." Evelyn stepped back, her mind racing. The first master. This entity had willingly embraced the hunger, allowed the house to consume them, just as she had done. But there was something else. A hidden truth, buried deep in its words. "You think you are the master, but you are only the latest in a long line of failures," the figure continued. "Each one of us came here, hungry for power, and each one of us was swallowed by the mansion. And you will be no different." The shadows around Evelyn writhed, as if the house itself were listening. The pulse of the mansion's hunger grew louder, more insistent. Evelyn could feel it in her bones, the deep ache for more. More power. More souls. "You will consume this house," the figure warned. "And when it is done with you, you will become part of it. A part of its endless hunger. And there will be no end to it." Evelyn shook her head. She refused to believe it. She was the master. She would not be consumed. But as the figure stepped into the light, its face came into view. And Evelyn gasped, her heart skipping a beat. The figure was her. It was her own face, twisted and contorted with the same hunger she now felt, the same power that had consumed her. "You are me," the figure whispered. "And I am you." Chapter 22, The Endless Cycle. Evelyn stumbled back, her mind reeling. The truth was impossible to comprehend. She was no different from the others before her. She was trapped in the same cycle, bound to the mansion just as they had been, consumed by the same hunger, the same insatiable need. The figure, herself, smiled a cold, knowing smile. "You are the latest in a long line of masters, Evelyn," it said. "And you will not be the last. The house will never stop. The hunger will never end." Evelyn stood frozen, the weight of her own fate crashing down on her. She was part of the mansion now. Part of its endless hunger. And there was no escaping. The mansion would always call for more. And she would always answer. Evelyn stood in the chamber, the echoes of her own tortured voice ringing in her ears. The figure before her, the first master, her twisted reflection, watched her with a cold, pitiless gaze. The room, once filled with dread, now felt eerily silent, save for the steady, rhythmic pulse of the mansion itself. The realization was sinking in. She was no different from the others who had come before her. The mansion was not just a house. It was a living, breathing force. A parasite, devouring all those who sought its power. Every master, every soul, every single life, absorbed into its dark hunger. And now, it was her turn. The whispers were gone, replaced by an awful silence. No longer did they beg for release. No longer did they cry for salvation. They had become part of the house, part of its unending appetite. Evelyn had become one with the mansion, just as the others had, just as it always would be. The figure stepped forward, its form blending with the shadows. Evelyn could feel her control slipping, the grip she had on her own body growing weaker. She was losing herself to the house, losing her identity, her will. Everything she had fought for, everything she had sacrificed, was slipping through her fingers like dust. "You are mine," the first master whispered, its voice a hollow echo of what Evelyn had once been. "And I was yours." Evelyn's heart clenched in agony. She could feel it, her very essence unraveling. Her memories, her identity, were being consumed. The house was feeding on her, just as it had fed on all the others. The hunger was relentless, and it was claiming her now. The mansion's walls groaned, the shadows twisting in unnatural patterns. The pulse of power grew stronger, the air thick with the weight of centuries of torment. It felt as if the very foundation of the house were trembling, as if the mansion itself were celebrating its victory. Evelyn's body trembled, her mind unraveling, her thoughts becoming clouded. She could hear the echoes of those who had come before her, whispers of their names, their cries, their warnings. They were all gone now. All consumed. And she would be, too. The first master, stretched out a hand, and Evelyn could feel herself drawn toward it, her body unwillingly moving, pulled by the irresistible force of the mansion. She could no longer fight. "We are one now," the figure said. "The mansion feeds on us, and we feed on it. The cycle never ends." Evelyn closed her eyes as the darkness closed in, the last of her consciousness slipping away. The hunger, the power, the twisted souls, all of it consumed her. And in the end, there was nothing left. Epilogue: The mansion's hunger. The mansion stood silent, its twisted silhouette looming against the night sky. Its windows were dark, its doors closed, but inside, it was alive. The halls were empty now, save for the faint, haunting whispers that echoed through the walls. They were the voices of the lost, the souls who had come to the mansion seeking refuge, seeking power. But now, they were all part of it. They were consumed by it. And somewhere, deep within its heart, Evelyn, now lost, twisted, and forgotten, watched over it all. She had become what she had feared most, the thing she had vowed never to be. She was the house. And the house was her. The hunger would never end.